Esther had been working at the Richardson house for 15 years now. 15 years of early mornings, aching feet, and holding her tongue. 15 years of yes ma'am, and no sir, and right away, even when her back was screaming from scrubbing floors all day. 15 years of watching the Richardson children grow up while her own daughter Rose only saw her on Sundays and some evenings, being raised mostly by Esther's mother back in their small house on the other side of town. The sun was beating down through the kitchen windows, making the already hot room feel like an oven. Esther wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand as she washed the lunch dishes. Mrs. Richardson was hosting her weekly tea with the neighborhood ladies that afternoon, and everything had to be perfect. These cups better shine. Like new, Mrs. Richardson had said earlier, her voice sharp as a tack. The ladies from the garden club are coming, and you know how they notice everything. Esther carefully picked up one of the delicate teacups from the soapy water. They were the fancy ones with gold trim and tiny pink roses painted on the sides. Mrs. Richardson only used them for special guests, which meant more work for Esther. These cups couldn't go in the drying rack like regular dishes. They had to be dried right away with a soft cloth to avoid water spots. As Esther reached for the drying cloth, her hands slippery from the soap, the worst happened. The teacup slipped from her fingers and hit the edge of the sink before landing on the floor. It didn't shatter completely, but a small piece broke off the rim, leaving a jagged edge where the gold pattern had been perfect just moments before. Esther's heart dropped into her stomach. She quickly knelt down to pick up the broken cup and the small piece that had come off. Maybe it could be glued back on, maybe Mrs. Richardson wouldn't notice. But even as these thoughts raced through her mind, Esther knew it was hopeless. Mrs. Richardson noticed everything in her house, especially when it came to her precious teacups. The sound of heels clicking on the hardwood floor made Esther freeze. Mrs. Richardson appeared in the doorway, her eyes immediately landing on Esther kneeling on the floor. "What was that noise?" Mrs. Richardson asked, her voice already rising with suspicion. Esther slowly stood up, the broken cup in her hands. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Richardson. It slipped. I'll pay for it out of my wages." Mrs. Richardson's face transformed from suspicion to anger in an instant. She marched across the kitchen and snatched the cup from Esther's hands. "Do you have any idea how much these cost? This set belonged to my grandmother. It's irreplaceable." Her voice grew louder with each word. "This is the third thing you've broken this month. First the vase, then the picture frame, and now this." "The cup was already cracked, ma'am," Esther said quietly, remembering the hairline crack she'd noticed last time she'd washed it. "I was being careful, but..." The slap came without warning. Mrs. Richardson's hand connected with Esther's cheek with such force that her head turned to the side. The sound echoed in the quiet kitchen. "Don't you dare tell me my cups were already damaged," Mrs. Richardson hissed. "You're getting careless and lazy. Maybe I should find someone younger who can do this job properly." Esther stood perfectly still, her cheek burning. This wasn't the first time Mrs. Richardson had slapped her. There had been other times over the years, when Esther was 5 minutes late because her mother was sick, when she'd accidentally used the wrong polish on the dining room table, when little Thomas Richardson had broken his toy and blamed it on her. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the heat of the day making everything feel more intense. Maybe it was the 15 years of built-up frustration finally reaching its limit. Or maybe it was the thought of Rose, now 17 and so bright, watching her mother come home with her spirit a little more broken each day. "I quit," Esther said so softly that Mrs. Richardson leaned forward. "What did you just say?" Esther looked directly into Mrs. Richardson's eyes, something she rarely did. "I said I quit. I won't be coming back tomorrow." Mrs. Richardson's mouth fell open in shock before she let out a sharp laugh. "Don't be ridiculous. Where would you go? Who would hire you? Everyone knows you can't even keep my house in order." "I'll find something," Esther said, her voice growing stronger. "Something better." "Better?" Mrs. Richardson laughed again. "There is nothing better for someone like you. You should be grateful I kept you on all these years despite your mistakes." The burning in Esther's cheek had spread to her chest, a fire of anger and determination lighting up inside her. "I've put up with your insults and your slaps for 15 years, Mrs. Richardson. I've raised your children alongside my own. I've polished your silver and scrubbed your floors and listened to you talk down to me every single day, but not anymore. Esther untied her apron and placed it neatly on the counter. With steady hands, she picked up her purse from the hook by the back door where she always kept it. You'll regret this, Mrs. Richardson called after her. You'll be back begging for your job by the end of the week. No one else will have you. Esther didn't turn around as she walked out the back door. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. But with each step down the garden path, she felt a little lighter. She had no idea what she would do next. The money from this job had put food on their table and was saving for Rose's college education. Her mother depended on her income for medicine. The practical part of her brain was screaming that she had made a terrible mistake. But as Esther walked down the street, away from the big house with its perfect lawn and shiny windows, something else was growing inside her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. Because Mrs. Richardson didn't know everything about Esther Williams. She didn't know about the law books hidden under Esther's bed. She didn't know about the correspondence courses Esther had been taking for years, studying late into the night after long days of cleaning and cooking. She didn't know about the bar exam Esther had secretly passed last month in the neighboring state. Mrs. Richardson saw only a maid, someone to clean her house and bear the brunt of her bad moods. She never bothered to look deeper to see the dreams and determination that had been growing all these years. Esther touched her cheek where the slap still stung. That slap had finally pushed her to do what she'd been afraid to do for years. It wasn't just about leaving a bad job. It was about finally becoming who she was meant to be. As she turned the corner and the Richardson house disappeared from view, Esther whispered to herself, "This isn't the end. It's just the beginning." And deep down, she knew it was true. Tomorrow, instead of putting on her maid's uniform, she would put on the one nice dress she owned and walk into Thomas Bell's law office downtown. She'd met him once at the courthouse when she was there researching for one of her courses. He was one of the few white lawyers in town known for being fair-minded. He needed help with his growing practice, and Esther needed a chance to use her mind instead of just her hands. It wouldn't be easy. People would talk. The Richardsons would try to make things difficult. But for the first time in 15 years, Esther was walking towards something instead of just enduring what life had given her. The final slap hadn't broken her. It had set her free. Esther stood outside the small brick building, her heart pounding in her chest. The sign on the door read Thomas Bell, Attorney at Law, in simple gold letters. She had walked past this building many times over the years, but never imagined she would one day be standing here as anything other than a cleaning lady. She smoothed down her best dress, navy blue with small white dots, and adjusted the collar. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and proper. Her hands were shaking slightly as she reached for the door handle. What if Mr. Bell laughed at her? What if he called Mrs. Richardson right away to tell her that her maid was trying to pretend she knew anything about the law? "You can do this," she whispered to herself. You didn't come this far to turn back now. The small bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The office was cooler than the hot summer air outside and smelled of paper and wood polish. A young white woman sat at the front desk, typing on a typewriter. She looked up with surprise when she saw Esther. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Black folks didn't usually walk into law offices through the front door in this town. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Bell, please," Esther said, keeping her voice steady. "Do you have an appointment?" The woman's fingers hovered over her appointment book. "No, ma'am, I don't, but I met Mr. Bell at the courthouse last year. He said if I ever needed legal help, I could come see him." It wasn't exactly a lie. Mr. Bell had been kind to her that day, helping her find the right section in the law library when she was lost, but he certainly hadn't offered his services. The woman looked doubtful, but picked up the telephone. "I'll see if he's available. Your name?" "Esther Williams." As the secretary spoke quietly into the phone, Esther fought the urge to turn and run. She could still go back to the Richardson house, apologize, say she had lost her temper in the heat. Mrs. Richardson might make her life miserable for a while, but at least it was a sure thing. This was jumping off a cliff and hoping you could fly. "Mr. Bell will see you," the secretary said, sounding surprised. "Last door on the right." The hallway seemed miles long as Esther walked down it. Pictures of stern-looking men in suits lined the walls, probably judges or important lawyers. None of them looked like they would believe a black woman who used to be a maid could know anything about the law. Thomas Bell was a tall man with kind eyes and graying hair at his temples. He stood up from behind his desk when Esther entered, which was not something white men usually did for black women. "Ms. Williams, correct? We met at the courthouse library. Please have a seat." Esther sat carefully on the edge of the wooden chair, her purse clutched in her lap. "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Bell. What can I help you with today? Are you having some legal troubles?" Esther took a deep breath. It was now or never. "No, sir. I came to ask about a job." Mr. Bell's eyebrows rose slightly. "A job? I'm afraid I don't need any cleaning staff at the moment. My wife's cousin comes in twice a week." "Not cleaning, sir." Esther's mouth felt dry. "I want to work as your legal assistant." For a moment, there was complete silence in the room. Then, Mr. Bell leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "Ms. Williams, that position requires legal knowledge and training. Do you have any experience in this field?" This was the moment Esther had been preparing for. She opened her purse and took out several folded papers. With steady hands, she placed them on Mr. Bell's desk. "Yes, sir, I do. These are certificates from my correspondence courses with Blackstone School of Law. I've been studying for 8 years. And this," she placed another document on top, "is my bar exam results from the state of Illinois. I had to travel there to take it, since they don't allow colored folks to take it here." Mr. Bell's eyes widened as he picked up the papers. He looked from the documents to Esther and back again, clearly shocked. "You passed the bar exam while working as a maid?" "Yes, sir. I studied at night after my work was done. My cousin works at the college library and helped me get books. It took longer than normal because I could only study a few hours each day, but I finished all the courses." Mr. Bell studied the papers carefully, his expression changing from shock to interest. "These are legitimate, and your scores are excellent." He looked up at her with new eyes. "May I ask why you're coming to me? Now? Why not years ago?" Esther touched her cheek, though the redness from Mrs. Richardson's slap had faded. "I needed the steady work at the Richardson house to support my family. But yesterday, things changed. I decided it was time to use what I've learned." She didn't share the details of the slap or her quitting. Some things were private, even in a moment like this. Mr. Bell nodded slowly. "I see. And you think I would hire you, knowing the trouble it would cause? This town isn't ready for a colored woman working in a law office as anything other than cleaning staff." "The law doesn't say a colored woman can't work in a law office," Esther replied. "And your reputation says you believe in fairness, Mr. Bell. I'm not asking for charity. Test me on any legal question you want. If I can't answer it correctly, I'll walk out that door and never bother you again." A small smile appeared on Mr. Bell's face. "All right, Ms. Williams. Let's say a client comes in with a dispute over property boundaries. Their neighbor has built a fence that encroaches 2 feet onto their land. What's the first thing you would advise?" Without hesitation, Esther replied, "I would first determine if there's a proper survey of the property on record with the county. If not, I would advise getting one done to establish the legal boundaries. Then I would look at how long the fence has been there, since adverse possession might come into play if it's been standing unchallenged for the statutory period." Mr. Bell nodded, looking impressed. "And if the neighbor refuses to move the fence even after being presented with the survey, then we would file for an injunction, asking the court to order the removal of the encroaching structure. We would also seek damages for any harm caused to the property, though that might be nominal. Most importantly, we would make sure the legal property line is clearly established by court order to prevent future disputes." Mr. Bell leaned forward, his fingers forming a steeple under his chin. "You really do know your stuff, Ms. Williams." "I've had a lot of time to study, sir. Working in people's houses, you hear all kinds of legal problems. Rich folks talk freely in front of their help as if we're not even there. I've heard about property disputes, divorce settlements, business contracts gone wrong, and I've looked up every single one in my law books." A long moment passed as Mr. Bell seemed to be thinking. Finally, he stood up and extended his hand across the desk. I can offer you a trial position, Ms. Williams. 1 month. If you prove yourself capable, we can discuss a permanent arrangement. The pay will be less than what you probably made at the Richardson house, at least to start. Esther stood and shook his hand, trying to contain the joy that threatened to burst out of her chest. Thank you, Mr. Bell. You won't regret this. I hope not, he said with a wry smile, because a lot of people in this town are going to be very unhappy about this arrangement. Are you prepared for that? Esther thought about Mrs. Richardson's slap, about 15 years of being treated as less than human, about all the nights studying by lamplight while her eyes burned with exhaustion. Yes, sir, she said firmly. I'm ready. As she walked out of the office with instructions to return tomorrow morning at 8 sharp, Esther felt like she was walking on air. Wait until she told Rose and her mother. For the first time, Rose would see that dreams really could come true, even for people like them. Even in a town like this. The final slap hadn't just pushed her out of the Richardson house. It had pushed her toward the future she had been preparing for all along. 1 month turned into 3, and Esther proved herself not just capable, but exceptional at her new job. Each morning, she arrived at Mr. Bell's office before anyone else, unlocking the door and preparing the day's files. She had a mind like a steel trap, remembering details from cases that even Mr. Bell sometimes forgot. Her handwriting was neat and precise on legal documents, and she had a way of explaining complicated legal matters in simple terms that clients appreciated. Of course, not everyone was happy about her new position. Some clients walked out when they saw a black woman sitting at a desk instead of cleaning it. Others demanded to speak directly with Mr. Bell, refusing to tell Esther why they were there. The secretary, Nancy, had quit after the first week, saying she wasn't raised to work alongside colored folk as equals. But Mr. Bell stood firm. He hired a new secretary, a young woman named Dorothy who had moved from up north and didn't seem bothered by working with Esther. And for every client who walked out, 2 more came in, curious about the law office that dared to be different. It was on a rainy Tuesday in October when everything changed again. Esther was alone in the office, organizing files, when the bell above the door jingled. She looked up to see a woman she recognized immediately, Luella Jenkins, who worked as a cook for the Whitfield family across town. Luella, what brings you here? Esther asked, coming around from behind her desk. Luella's eyes were red from crying, and she clutched a damp handkerchief in her hands. Esther, I heard you was working here now. I need help. Esther guided her to a chair. What's happened? It's Mr. Whitfield. He fired me yesterday after 10 years of cooking for his family. Luella's voice broke. No warning, no nothing. Just said he didn't need me anymore and gave me my last week's pay. Did he give a reason? Esther asked, her mind already running through possible legal angles. Said his wife wanted to try that new cooking service where they deliver meals ready to heat up. Luella twisted the handkerchief in her hands. But that's not the real reason. Last week I asked for 3 days off to go to my sister's funeral in Georgia. He said yes, but he was angry about it. This is his way of punishing me. Esther felt a familiar anger rising in her chest, the same feeling she'd had that day in Mrs. Richardson's kitchen. Did you have a contract? Any written agreement about your employment? Luella shook her head. Nothing like that. Just his word that I had steady work as long as I did a good job. And I did do a good job, Esther. Never missed a day except when my sister died. Esther took Luella's hand. I know you did. And what Mr. Whitfield did isn't right, but I'm not sure if it's illegal since Georgia is an at-will employment state. I don't care about going back there, Luella said. I just need my pension. He promised me a pension after 10 years. I've been counting on that money for when I get too old to work. Esther's eyes narrowed. He promised you a pension? Was that in writing? No, but he said it in front of his whole family at Christmas dinner 5 years ago. Said I was part of the family and would be taken care of in my old age. Esther thought for a moment. That might be enough. Verbal promises can sometimes be enforced, especially with witnesses. As Esther took notes about Luella's situation, thought began forming in her mind. Luella wasn't the only domestic worker who had been treated unfairly. There were dozens of women like her all over town, cooks, maids, nannies, working without contracts, without protection, at the mercy of employers who could fire them on a whim. Luella, do you know other folks who've been treated badly by their employers? Fired without cause, denied promised benefits, that sort of thing? Luella gave a bitter laugh. Do I know others? Honey, we could fill a church with stories like mine. That evening, after Mr. Bell had gone home, Esther stayed late at the office. She pulled out law books and began researching employment law, contract law, civil rights statutes, cases involving verbal promises and implied contracts. She wrote late into the night, filling page after page with notes. By morning, she had a plan. Not just for Luella, but for all the domestic workers in town who had been mistreated over the years. When Mr. Bell arrived, Esther was waiting with a stack of papers on his desk. What's all this? He asked, hanging up his hat. A case I'd like us to take, Esther said. A big one. Mr. Bell raised his eyebrows but sat down to listen. As Esther laid out her idea, a class action lawsuit on behalf of domestic workers against the wealthiest families in town, his expression changed from surprise to concern to cautious interest. This would make us enemies of every powerful person in town, he said when she finished. We'd lose half our clients overnight. But we'd gain new ones, Esther countered. People who've never had a lawyer stand up for them before. Mr. Bell leaned back in his chair, studying her face. Why is this so important to you, Esther? She thought about Mrs. Richardson's slap, about Luella's tears, about all the women she knew who had spent their lives cooking and cleaning for others with nothing to show for it in the end. Because it's right, she said simply, and because if we don't do it, who will? After a long moment, Mr. Bell nodded. All right, let's do it. But we do it smart. We start with Luella's case alone, a simple breach of promise claim against Mr. Whitfield. Once we win that, then we talk about expanding. Esther smiled. It was a start. The news that a black former maid was suing one of the wealthiest men in town spread like wildfire. People stopped Esther on the street, some to congratulate her bravery, others to call her terrible names. Mrs. Richardson made a point of crossing to the other side of the street whenever she saw Esther coming. But the most surprising reaction came from the other domestic workers. They started coming to the office after hours, maids and cooks and nannies, some still in their uniforms, all with stories to tell. Esther listened to each one, taking careful notes, building a case that grew stronger by the day. Mr. Whitfield, meanwhile, was furious. He tried to get the case thrown out, claiming that a verbal promise made at a Christmas dinner couldn't possibly be legally binding. When that failed, he offered a small settlement, far less than what Luella was owed. Take it, he told her when they met for the court-ordered mediation. Because you'll get nothing if this goes to trial. No one's going to take the word of a colored cook over mine. But he underestimated Luella's determination and Esther's preparation. Because Esther had found something Mr. Whitfield didn't know existed, a Christmas card he had given to Luella 5 years ago, with a handwritten note thanking her for her service and reiterating his promise of a pension after your 10 years with us are complete. When Esther produced this card at the mediation, the color drained from Mr. Whitfield's face. Where did you get that? He demanded. Luella kept all her Christmas cards, Esther replied calmly. She valued the kind words you wrote. Back when you were still speaking kindly to her. The mediator, a retired judge, examined the card closely. This changes things, Mr. Whitfield. If we go to trial with this evidence, I believe Ms. Jenkins would prevail. 2 days later, Mr. Whitfield's lawyer called to offer a full settlement. The pension Luella had been promised, plus damages for the unfair dismissal. It was more money than Luella had ever seen at one time. We won, Esther told her when she came to sign the papers. You won. Luella hugged her tightly. No, child, we all won, because you showed us we can fight back. As news of the victory spread, more domestic workers came forward, eager to tell their stories and seek justice. The trickle became a flood. Esther's notebook filled with names and details, unpaid wages, broken promises, years of verbal abuse, even physical assaults like the slap that had changed Esther's own life. Mr. Bell hired 2 more staff members just to handle the influx of cases. The small brick office became a hub of activity, with people coming and going at all hours. Some white folks in town began calling it the Trouble House, but to the black community it was a place of hope. 6 months after she had walked out of the Richardson house, Esther stood before a judge and filed the papers for what would become known as the Domestic Workers Class Action, a lawsuit that named 28 of the wealthiest families in town as defendants, including the Richardsons. As she walked out of the courthouse that day, a reporter from the local newspaper stopped her. "Ms. Williams, is it true that you used to be a maid yourself? What made you decide to become a lawyer and take on this case?" Esther thought about all the changes that had happened since that hot summer day when Mrs. Richardson had slapped her for the last time. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "it takes a final push to make you realize you've been heading in the wrong direction all along." That evening, as Esther walked home, she noticed Mrs. Richardson watching her from across the street. For a moment, their eyes met. Esther didn't smile or nod, but she didn't look away either. She stood tall, her law books under her arm, her future stretching out before her. The final slap had been meant to put her in her place. Instead, it had helped her find it. The domestic workers' class action lawsuit became the talk of the town. Some people called it a revolution, others called it an outrage. The local newspaper ran headlines like, "Former Maid takes on town's elite," and "Domestic workers rise up." For weeks, it seemed like no one could talk about anything else. The defendants, those 28 wealthy families, were stunned at first. They had never imagined their maids and cooks and nannies would dare to challenge them in court. But shock quickly turned to anger, and then to action. They hired the best lawyers money could buy. They held secret meetings to coordinate their defense. They began a whisper campaign against Esther, spreading rumors that she had stolen from her employers, that she wasn't really qualified, that she was stirring up trouble just to make a name for herself. Worst of all, they pressured other families not to hire any of the domestic workers who had joined the lawsuit. Suddenly, women who had worked steadily for years couldn't find jobs. They would show up for interviews only to be told the position had already been filled. Luella came to the office one rainy afternoon, her face tight with worry. "They're trying to starve us out, Esther. Half the women in the case can't pay their rent this month. Some are talking about dropping out." Esther felt a cold, not of fear in her stomach. She had expected resistance, but not this kind of coordinated attack. These families had power that went beyond money. They had influence over nearly every aspect of town life. "We can't let them win like this," she said, more to herself than to Luella. That night, Esther couldn't sleep. She paced the small living room of the house she shared with her mother and daughter, trying to think of a solution. Rose watched her with worried eyes. "Maybe you should let it go, Mama," Rose said softly. "You've already helped Luella. That's more than most people ever do." Esther shook her head. "It's not just about Luella anymore. It's about all of us. About you." She touched her daughter's cheek. "I want you to grow up in a world where you can't be slapped for breaking a teacup, where your work is valued, where you have rights that can't be taken away on someone's whim." The next morning, Esther had an idea. If the defendants were working together against them, why couldn't the plaintiffs work together too? She called a meeting at the First Hope Church, the only place in town big enough to hold all the women involved in the lawsuit. More than 60 women showed up, filling the wooden pews, their faces a mix of determination and fear. Esther stood at the front, feeling nervous but resolute. She had never spoken to such a large group before. "I know many of you are struggling," she began. "The families we're suing are making sure of that. They think if they make us hungry enough, we'll give up." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the church. "But what they don't understand is that we've been hungry before. We've faced harder times than this and survived. And we did it by helping each other." Esther outlined her plan. They would form the Domestic Workers Association. Members would pool their resources to help those who couldn't find work. Those who still had jobs would contribute what they could to support those who didn't. They would share job opportunities, childcare, even meals. "We don't need their charity," Esther said, her voice growing stronger. "We need justice, and to get it, we need to stand together." By the end of the meeting, the Domestic Workers Association was born. They elected officers, set up a relief fund, and created committees to handle different tasks. For the first time, many of these women felt like they were part of something bigger than themselves. As they were leaving, an older woman named Pearl, who had worked as a nanny for 40 years, took Esther's hand. "I never thought I'd see this day," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "All these years we've been working in the same houses, facing the same problems, but each of us thinking we were alone. Now look at us." The association became more than just a support system during the lawsuit. It became a community. Women who had only known each other in passing while hurrying to their employers' houses now sat together at meetings, shared Sunday dinners, watched each other's children. They swapped stories about the families they worked for and realized how similar their experiences were, the good and the bad. And as they grew closer, their resolve to see the lawsuit through only strengthened. Mr. Bell was impressed by what Esther had accomplished. "You've turned a legal case into a movement," he told her one day as they prepared for court. "That's something even experienced lawyers rarely manage to do." The lawsuit proceeded slowly through the courts, with the defendant's lawyers filing motion after motion to delay and complicate the proceedings. They argued that domestic workers weren't covered by certain labor laws, that verbal agreements weren't binding, that each case should be tried separately rather than as a class action. Each delay was frustrating, but it also gave the association time to grow stronger. They started a newsletter sharing information about workers' rights and updates on the case. They organized training sessions where women could learn new skills, typing, bookkeeping, basic nursing, to expand their job opportunities. And most importantly, they began advocating for written contracts for domestic workers, spelling out wages, hours, and benefits. "Even if we don't win in court," Esther told the group, "we can change how things work going forward. No more handshake agreements that can be broken on a whim. No more promises that disappear when they're no longer convenient." 6 months into the lawsuit, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Pembroke, one of the defendants, approached Esther after a court hearing. "Ms. Williams, might I have a word?" she asked, her voice low so others wouldn't hear. Esther was surprised but nodded and followed her to a quiet corner of the courthouse hallway. "I've been thinking about what you said in your deposition," Mrs. Pembroke said, looking uncomfortable, "about how domestic workers deserve the same protections as any other workers. I've employed the same housekeeper, Ida, for 22 years. I've always thought I treated her well, but I've never given her a written contract or any guarantee of her position." Mrs. Pembroke took a deep breath. "I'd like to settle my part of this lawsuit, and I'd like your help drafting a proper employment agreement for Ida, with fair terms." Esther could hardly believe what she was hearing. Mrs. Pembroke was one of the most respected women in town. If she broke ranks with the other defendants, "I would be happy to help with that," Esther said carefully. "May I ask what changed your mind?" Mrs. Pembroke's eyes grew distant. "My mother was in service before she married my father. She never talked about it much, but when this lawsuit began, I found her old diary, the things she wrote about how she was treated." She shook her head. "I've been on the wrong side of this, Ms. Williams. I'd like to make it right." Word of Mrs. Pembroke's defection spread quickly. Within weeks, 3 more families approached Mr. Bell about settling their cases and establishing proper employment terms for their staff. The remaining defendants doubled down on their resistance, but there was a sense that the tide was turning. The local newspaper, which had initially been skeptical of the lawsuit, ran an editorial supporting the Domestic Workers Association and their fight for fair treatment. Even some of the white ladies in town began to question the status quo. At the garden club, the bridge club, even after church on Sundays, there were whispered conversations about whether it was really right to employ someone for years without any job security or benefits. One evening, as Esther was locking up the office, she was surprised to see Thomas Richardson, Mrs. Richardson's teenage son, waiting outside. "Thomas, what are you doing here?" she asked. wary of his presence. The boy looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot. "My mother doesn't know I'm here," he said quickly, "but I wanted to tell you something." Esther waited, curious despite herself. "I heard her talking to my father last night, about the lawsuit, about you." Thomas looked down at his shoes. "She said she was wrong to treat you the way she did. She didn't think you'd hurt her, but I was in the next room." Esther was stunned. "Mrs. Richardson admitting she was wrong?" "She's too proud to say it to your face," Thomas continued. "But I thought you should know. And also," he reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This is for the association. It's my allowance from the last 3 months. I want to help." As Thomas hurried away, Esther opened the envelope to find nearly $30 inside, a significant amount from a boy his age. She smiled, thinking how things were changing in ways she never could have predicted. The Domestic Workers Association continued to grow, with new members joining every week. They rented a small storefront downtown to serve as their headquarters, with a sign proudly displayed in the window: "Dignity, respect, fair treatment." Inside, women gathered to share stories, offer support, and plan for the future. Some were still working in the big houses on the hill, but now with written contracts and clear expectations. Others had found different paths, starting small, businesses working in shops or offices pursuing education. 1 year after the final slap that had changed her life, Esther stood in the association headquarters, looking around at all they had accomplished. The lawsuit was still making its way through the courts, but in many ways they had already won. They had created something that would last beyond any legal verdict, a community that valued each member, that fought for justice, that refused to accept that some people were worth less than others, simply because of the work they did or the color of their skin. As Pearl had said on that first night, "Now look at us." The final slap had been meant to put Esther in her place. Instead, it had helped all of them find a new place, one they had built together. 5 years had passed since the day Mrs. Richardson slapped Esther in that hot kitchen. 5 years of hard work, challenges, victories, and changes that no one could have predicted. The domestic workers' class action lawsuit had finally been resolved 3 years ago, not with a dramatic courtroom verdict, but with a comprehensive settlement that changed the landscape of domestic work in their town and beyond. Most of the defendants had eventually come to the table, realizing that fighting the case was costing them more, in money, reputation, and community standing, than settling it would. The terms they agreed to were groundbreaking: back pay for unpaid overtime, compensation for unfair dismissals, and most importantly, a set of standards for domestic employment moving forward. Now, every household worker in town had a written contract clearly stating hours, wages, duties, and benefits. The Domestic Workers Association had grown into a powerful force with over 200 members and branches in 3 neighboring towns. They offered legal advice, job placement services, skills training, and a strong support network. Esther had completed her legal education formally, receiving her law degree through a special program at the state university for those who had passed the bar but lacked traditional schooling. Mr. Bell had made her a full partner in his practice, which was now called Bell & Williams Attorneys at Law. On this particular morning, Esther stood in front of the mirror in her office, adjusting the collar of her new suit. Today was a big day. She was giving the keynote address at the Southern Conference for Workers' Rights. People were coming from 5 states to hear her speak about the changes they had made and how other communities could do the same. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Rose entered, looking beautiful in a navy blue dress, her college graduation pin displayed proudly on the collar. At 22, she had her mother's determination and intelligence, tempered with a confidence that Esther had only developed later in life. "Are you ready, Mama?" "The car's waiting," Rose said. Esther smiled at her daughter. Thanks to the improved income from her legal career, Rose had been able to attend college without working herself to exhaustion. She had graduated with honors and was now teaching at the local high school, the first black teacher they had ever hired. "Almost ready," Esther replied, picking up her speech notes from the desk. "Just a little nervous." You'll be wonderful, Rose assured her. You always are. As they walked through the office, Esther greeted the staff, a mix of white and black employees working side by side, something that would have been unimaginable 5 years ago. The world wasn't perfect, far from it, but things were changing, one step at a time. Outside, a car was indeed waiting, but Esther was surprised to see Luella in the driver's seat. Luella, I thought you were already at the conference center helping with the setup, Esther said as she slid into the passenger seat. I was, but we have a stop to make first, Luella replied with a mysterious smile. Someone wants to see you. Before your speech. Esther raised her eyebrows but didn't ask questions. Luella had become one of her closest friends over the years. After winning her case against Mr. Whitfield, she had used part of her settlement to open a small catering business that was now thriving. Instead of heading toward the conference center downtown, Luella drove to the east side of town, where many of the domestic workers lived. She pulled up in front of the association headquarters, which had expanded to occupy an entire building. What's going on? Esther asked, curious now. You'll see, Rose said with a smile, exchanging a knowing look with Luella. Inside the building, Esther was stunned to find the main hall filled with people, association members, their families, clients from the law firm, and many faces she didn't immediately recognize. A banner hung across the wall, celebrating 5 years of change, honoring Esther Williams. Surprise, they all called as she entered. Esther's hand flew to her mouth. What is all this? Pearl, now the association's president, came forward. Did you really think we'd let the 5-year anniversary of our beginning pass without a celebration? Especially on the day you're speaking to folks from all over the South about what we've accomplished? Esther was moved to tears as person after person came up to share how the association and the lawsuit had changed their lives. There was Dorothy, the secretary who had replaced Nancy at Mr. Bell's office, who had gone on to get her own legal training, and now handled all the association's paperwork. There was Henry, Luella's son, who had used the educational fund the association had established to attend trade school and was now running his own electrical business. There was Mrs. Pembroke, who had become an unlikely ally, using her social connections to advocate for fair treatment of domestic workers among her wealthy friends. And most surprisingly, there was Thomas Richardson, now a young man in college, who volunteered at the association teaching reading classes on weekends. I never thought I'd see the day when this many people would come together like this, Pearl said, her voice thick with emotion. Black and white, young and old, all working toward something better. After the speeches and congratulations, as why, people mingled and enjoyed Luella's excellent food, Esther found a quiet corner to catch her breath. The surprise celebration had left her feeling overwhelmed but deeply grateful. A voice behind her made her turn. Ms. Williams? Do you have a moment? Esther was shocked to see Mrs. Richardson standing there, looking older and somehow smaller than Esther remembered. They had seen each other around town over the years but had never spoken directly since that day in the kitchen. Mrs. Richardson, Esther said, keeping her voice neutral. This is unexpected. Mrs. Richardson's hands fidgeted with her purse. I wasn't sure I should come, but Thomas insisted. He said it was important. An awkward silence fell between them. 5 years of unspoken words hanging in the air. I owe you an apology, Mrs. Richardson finally said, her voice low, for how I treated you when you worked for me, especially that last day. Esther was stunned. She had never expected to hear those words from Mrs. Richardson. What changed your mind? She asked quietly. Mrs. Richardson sighed. Many things. Watching how Thomas admires you, seeing what you've built here. She gestured around the room. But mostly it was having to clean my own house for 6 months after you left. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. Do you know how hard it is to get streak-free windows? I never appreciated how good you were at your job until I had to do it myself. Despite herself, Esther chuckled. It takes practice. Yes, it does, Mrs. Richardson agreed. Just like it takes practice to admit when you've been wrong for a very long time. She took a deep breath. I was raised to believe certain people were meant to serve others. That some work was dignified and some wasn't. That some people were less than others. She looked directly at Esther. You proved me wrong. Not just with the lawsuit or your legal career, but with how you've helped everyone around you rise up too. Esther didn't know what to say. This was a conversation she had imagined many times, but it was nothing like she had expected. Thank you for saying that, she finally replied. It means something, especially today. Mrs. Richardson nodded, then reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. This is for the association's education fund. It's not enough to make up for the past, but it's a start. As Mrs. Richardson walked away, Rose appeared at Esther's side. Was that Mrs. Richardson? What did she want? Esther looked at the envelope, in her hand, then at the room full of people whose lives had changed because of a moment of defiance 5 years ago. She wanted to be part of the change, Esther said simply. Later, as Esther stood at the podium at the Southern Conference for Workers' Rights, looking out at hundreds of faces turned toward her expectantly, she felt a sense of completion. Not that the work was done, far from it, but that the circle that had begun with that slap in the kitchen had somehow closed. 5 years ago, she began, I was a maid who had reached her breaking point. Today, I stand before you as an attorney, a community leader, and a woman who has seen what is possible when we refuse to accept injustice as normal. She told them about the lawsuit, about the association, about the changes they had fought for, and won. She shared stories of women who had found their voices and their power, of families who had learned to see the people who worked in their homes as human beings, deserving of dignity and fair treatment. The path hasn't been easy, she continued. There were times when we almost gave up, when the obstacles seemed too great. But we discovered something important along the way. We are stronger together than we ever could be alone. As she spoke, Esther thought about all the pieces that had come together to create this moment. Her years of secret studying, Mr. Bell's willingness to take a chance on her, Luella's courage in being the first to seek justice, the community that had formed around their shared struggle. Change doesn't always come from where you expect it, she said. Sometimes it takes a moment of pain to push us towards something better. For me, it was a slap that was meant to put me in my place. Instead, it set me free. From the back of the room, Esther could see Rose standing with Luella and Pearl, their faces shining with pride. Next to them was Thomas Richardson, listening intently, the future in his young eyes. So when people ask me what happened after that final slap, Esther concluded, her voice strong and clear, I tell them this. We built something new. We created a community based on respect and dignity. We changed not just how we work, but how we see each other and ourselves. She smiled at the audience, feeling the weight and the wonder of the journey that had brought her here. And we're just getting started. The applause that followed was like a wave, washing away the last echoes of that kitchen slap from 5 years ago. As Esther stepped away from the podium, she knew that the sound of hands coming together in appreciation was healing in a way that the sound of a hand striking in anger never could be. The final slap had been just the beginning of her story. What came after, the courage, the community, the change, that was the real miracle. That was what no one could have ever imagined.